Hello, everybody. It's so great to see everybody in person. I see a lot of familiar faces and have met a lot of faces that were familiar, but I haven't actually seen your face till tonight. So it's so great to be here with like minded people. I'm Pricilla Stone, and I host the Quantum Witch Cafe YouTube channel and podcast. I created it to connect with people just like you and to talk about cool books about the occult, paranormal, UAP, if you're fancy, UFOs, all that good stuff. So, one thing that I wanted to talk about really quickly before I introduce our next guest is how every single person in here has a role when it comes to figuring out what is going on. Because everybody's here for a different reason. If you're a skeptic, you're here because you have doubts. If you're an experiencer, you're here because you've had contact. And if you're just a scientist that's just as curious as experiencers and skeptics combined, you're here as well. So I think that conferences like this are super important when it comes to uh, figuring this out. It's multidisciplinary. So that's why we have people talking about biology, consciousness, and reality, whether we perceive it as absolute or just as the world is. So I just want to say that everybody here is just, you're a piece of the puzzle. And it's very important to remember that you have a role, whether you're the housewife in suburbia, the scientist at Stanford, or the person just curious about what all this means. Our next guest is a speaker, a artist, I would call him when it comes to teaching about the occult, mind metaphysics. He's an award-winning author from books such as Occult America and Daydream Believer more recently, and even more recently, Uncertain Places. He has this gift of relaying and extracting information from esoteric practices and speakers such as Neville Goddard or the Kabbalion, and making it usable for anybody that has access to his books, YouTube, website, and now tonight. So I welcome Mr. Mitch Horowitz to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you, Priscilla, and a great thanks to the organizers of this event. What an absolutely wonderful day. I've been very touched by the presentations and the quality of the dialogue. I, um, I think there's a model that is emerging within the seeking community that is on display here. And I should say, when I speak of the seeking community, I'm speaking very broadly. In a certain sense, I'm the in-law in the house tonight because I am someone who writes about and documents metaphysical experience in history and in practice. I am not specifically dedicated to studying the UFO thesis, although I care very deeply about it. I am specifically interested in considering the metaphysical qualities, potentially the causative qualities of thought, something that some of the other speakers have been referencing. And as such, I suppose I'm really deeply dedicated to discovering points of convergence in metaphysical history and in the spiritual search. When I say spiritual, I mean extra physical, and ways that these things can be useful and be brought above ground to the seeker today. And it seems to me that we are living through a very special moment, and I say that with great care, where the question of extra physicality, interdimensionality, the capacity of the psyche to move through different intersections of time has almost crested into a kind of wave, thanks in part to the efforts of some of the very people in this room, so that these questions have gone very mainstream in a way that I couldn't have imagined even 5 years ago. And I really want to say that with great care because I always know that the Halloween season has dawned, not when they start putting up pictures of pumpkins and witches at the CVS pharmacy, But when I start getting calls from mainstream journalists who decide that it's time to write their yearly article on seances or some such, and I always get the same two questions. The first is, um, why do people believe this stuff? And of course, the expectation is always that I'm going to talk about anxiety over the economy or the environment or concerns about foreign affairs, the dissolution of the family. There's supposed to be all these sociological reasons that drive people to believe in or search for personal answers in the extra physical. But the thing that's almost prima facie taken off the table is that, well, people believe in these things because they're actually going on, because they're true. And I had a dialogue with my friend Richard Smoley several months ago on YouTube through the auspices of the Theosophical Society. And Richard, who's a brilliant scholar of esoteric history, he and I were having a broad-ranging discussion about occult topics, and I said to him, "Why do you think astrology has attained such posterity across human history?" And he sort of paused and stroked his chin, and he said, "Well, because it's pretty accurate." And I enjoyed that chin-out answer. Whether one agrees with that or not is a whole other question. But I appreciated that someone of intellect would kind of take a break from the usual sociological lay terms and lay explanations and put out there the prospect of belief. I describe myself as a believing historian, and I don't think belief is something that we have to apologize for. I don't ascribe seriousness to a person based specifically upon what his or her area of inquiry is, so much as I do the excellence of the tools that are brought to it, which is something I'm going to come back to. So that's always question one from most of, not all, most of the mainstream journalists. Why do people still believe this stuff? And the notion is, well, it's because we're poised on this generational precipice, as if every previous generation has not felt itself on a precipice. I mean, of course, we face grievous issues today, and I don't mean to be glib about any of that. I can assure you, I take climate change very seriously. I take the simmering situation in Ukraine very seriously. I take the civil war in Syria very seriously. These are grave, grave issues. But imagine if you were alive during the era of World War I, where you had literally a single digit percentage of the population killed, either in the war or in the ensuing flu that followed and ravaged civilization for several years thereafter. So it's nothing new to say that we as a generation feel that we're settled on some sort of a precipice. So I don't go in for the sociological reasons, or gosh, I shouldn't put that in too blanket a way, but I don't go into the sociological reasons as this uber explanation for why people are interested in the paranormal or the unseen. And the other question that always comes at this time of year, ringing in Halloween, is there an occult revival? Has the internet resulted in a vaster number of people? I'm glad you're all laughing. You're all having the same experience as I am. Um, are there vaster numbers of people availing themselves of astrology, tarot, you name it, because of the internet and so on and so forth? And I've always resisted giving in to the temptation to describe some sort of occult revival or paradigm shift or shift in consciousness. My answer in years past has always been, look, interest in the esoteric, interest in the occult, interest in the paranormal, interest in the extraphysical is really an evergreen in our culture. We've gone through different discernible periods in history where we've witnessed occult revivals. For example, in the late 19th century, through the work of Eliphas Levi and Madame H.P. Blavatsky and the Theosophical Revolution, clearly there was a great upsurge of interest in pre-Christian spirituality, Eastern spirituality, esoteric spirituality. here in the Western world. Clearly, in the late 1960s, with the advent of the Woodstock generation, and not to mention immigration changes here in the United States, there was an upsurge of interest in yoga, meditation, Zen, all things occult, because there was a questioning of all things traditional. So that was a discernible change. Ever since then, I've been hesitant to classify there being some sort of a revival or some sort of a change uh, apropos of people's interest in the unseen, the extra physical, the so called paranormal, the anomalous. But that's changed. I really think we are going through something entirely new. And that is thanks in part to someone who is in this room, and that's Leslie Keene and the work of her immediate colleagues. Things are changing. Things are changing. I'll never forget the experience in the late summer of 2019. Um, I biked up to the Guggenheim Museum for a panel that some of you were at, because I know some of y'all, on the UFO experience. And I learned two things. In August, do not bike to the Guggenheim in a leather jacket. It was soaking wet, and everybody was still very, very nice to me. And after the panel was over, and the room was packed, I mean, it was standing room only in this very large, beautiful Art Deco auditorium that had been designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. And the curator, a very brilliant man named Troy Therian, came up to me. Now remember, this is late summer of 2019, so it was before the COVID lockdown. And he said, look, at what point in our culture do you think it's going to become intellectually embarrassing to dismiss the UFO thesis? And I stopped and I thought for a moment, and I said, honestly, right now, right at this instant, you know, there's there's simply no one of any serious intellectual gravity today who would dismiss the UFO thesis as, swamp gas, little green men, you're imagining things, you're drinking moonshine, what have you. And it really is such a dramatic, dramatic change. And my hope is that things usually happen as part of a concert or a series of events. It's quite rare that something goes on that's just isolated and limited to its own particular discipline. So my hope is that with the mainstreaming of the UFO thesis, we are also going to see a greater opening in the field of psychical research or ESP research, which is something that I personally care a great deal about and spend a great deal of time probing. And I think we're going to, in fact, it's simply inevitable, see a ripple effect throughout society. The recent winners of the Nobel Prize in physics won their award for their adaptations of Bell's theorem, which essentially, to put it colloquially, helps us to more accurately measure something that we don't understand at all, actually, which is what Isaac Newton used to call the mirror effect, and what Albert Einstein somewhat humorously called spooky action at a distance, which is the manner in which objects, either on a particle micro scale and also on a macro scale, mirror reverse one another and change position, change polarity, even change electrical charge based upon the action at a great distance, either on the particulate level or on the macro cosmological level, based upon an object that has no apparent relationship to it. And it's just one of these measurements, one among many that we've discovered in the hard sciences, that are telling us that we live in an interrelated cosmos. and we don't understand vast, vast, and constant relationships that govern the lives of particles, celestial bodies, and organisms just within the measurable Newtonian world that we find ourselves. The founders of quantum mechanics, it bears noting, were all believers in the perceptual basis of reality. They were all, to some greater or lesser extent, philosophical idealists, not philosophical materialists. The whole basis of world-class modern science, the whole basis from a philosophical perspective, is what might be called idealism. The notion that your perception, your psyche, plays a role not only in experience, not only in experiencing, but actually in concretizing what is there, in concretizing what is there. And this is where the UFO thesis and the study of ESP begin to come into a kind of convergence. You know, it's really, really remarkable the strides that have been made in the study of ESP and precognition, given the funding atmosphere, which is really, really rough, even though that research is very inexpensive, and the unremitting and profoundly polemical and inaccurate nature of professional skepticism and the weight that it has placed on the shoulders of the community of scientists, statisticians, researchers who are studying ESP in a lab-based setting. One of the recent advances that we've seen in ESP research has marked quite recently its 10-year anniversary. And this 10-year anniversary is very important because it has permitted a decade in which the results could be verified through meta-analysis. The research I'm referring to was performed by a clinical psychologist at Cornell University named Darrell Bem, who I know some of you have heard of. In 2011, Darrell Bem published a paper that reported on results that he had attained in the course of 9 experiments that he conducted painstakingly over a previous decade. And Bem's experiments, in short, were intended to study a precognition or retrocausality, in which events in what we would refer to as the future, which is a construct, as some of the other speakers have adequately demonstrated, affect what we experience in the present. And the most exciting and innovative of Bem's experiments, and I also should say a word about my friend Dean Radin at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, who has also conducted experiments along these lines and met with similar confirmatory results as Bem. But the most innovative experiments that Bem attempted were numbers 8 and 9 in his 10-year study. And this was where things got really hot in the media after Bem published his results in a scholarly, peer-reviewed psychology journal, not a place given to occult passions. And what Bem did, in short, and this is particular to experiment number 9, is that he asked subjects to perform a very simple cognitive task, which was memorizing a group of words on a list. And after memorizing this group of words for a short period of time, he then tested their recall. No big deal, right? Somebody gives you 10 or 12 words on a list to memorize. You done? Okay. How many do you recall? Well, you might recall 4, 5, something like that. So Bem ran the test for the standard results. And then, in one of his test groups, which was repeated over many, many different trials, he had the same group of subjects memorize the same list a short time later. Okay? So they're doing the simple cognitive exercise the first time around. Second time around, they're doing the same simple cognitive exercise with the one added wrinkle that they're studying the same list again in the near future. When he added the wrinkle of studying the same list again in the near future, the test results spiked when people performed their cognitive exercise of word memorization in the so-called past. So think of it. I give you a list of 10 words or what have you to memorize. Memorize them, what's the results? Fine, very good. We do the same exact thing with the one wrinkle that this time you're going to study the thing a little ways in the future, not knowing that, and your results spike. Your results spike. It's called retrocausality. He conducted this over thousands and thousands and thousands of trials, and he found a statistically significant difference of just a few percentage points, but persistent, constant, like a signal in the noise, that was indicating that there was a retrocausal effect to the benefit of the cognitive subjects who had studied the word list in the so-called future. It violates all common observation, just as quantum physics did starting in the 1930s. And so there were articles about this, there were debates about this, there were howls of protest from all of my dear, dear friends in the skeptics community who said, it's crazy, it's pure garbage, it's an embarrassment to the whole field of the social sciences. One of the primary criticisms of ESP research is lack of replicability. That's supposed to be the gold standard of science, replicability. So there were a group of skeptics who decided to rerun one of Bem's exercises. How did they rerun it? Bem, in what has to be one of the finest displays of intellectual integrity that the social sciences has seen in my lifetime, he opened up his entire database for anyone to review. He provided the software that he used in devising his studies free to anyone who asked. He devised an instruction manual, all of it at his own expense. He devised an instruction manual that would permit any researcher to rerun his experiments. And he turned all of this over to anybody for the asking. So, these studies, to which he had dedicated a decade of his life and published in a mainstream, widely regarded, juried psychological journal, were subject to retest by a group of 3 skeptics. And in the space of a year, they put out their study. Bem's original paper was called Feeling the Future. They gave their study the media-friendly title of Failing the Future. Get it? And their results were non-confirmatory. But dig this. They left out one critical detail. When they registered their experiment, and I write all about this in my book, Daydream Believer. There's also an article I have up at Boing Boing called Is Precognition Real? So if you want to check all this out, check it out there. And there's lots of footnotes. And I ask people to read the footnotes. Hold me to it. See if I'm exaggerating. See if I'm exaggerating. So the critics created an open source database where they pre-registered, they announced their experiments, and they said anybody who has run these experiments themselves, any researchers, are welcome to contribute to our database, and we will run your results. So they got 3 contributions to their database. One was non-confirmatory, the other 2 were confirmatory. According to their own rules of the road, they said, we're pre-registering our experiments, we're creating a database. Any researcher who has repeated this material is welcome to contribute to it, and we will report the results. They did not report the 2 confirmatory results. BEM, as is appropriate, wrote a response and said, why didn't you guys report these other confirmatory results? You violated your own rules of the road. And one of the researchers responded by saying, oh yeah? Well, there was this other experiment that didn't work, and you never reported that in your original, and blah, 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 which was not true because that other non-confirmatory experiment was reviewed with one of BEM's editors, and they made a perfectly transparent decision not to include it and laid out their reasons for doing so. However, this is what's called changing the subject. Let's hold a whole conference on why Darrell didn't include that one piece. I'll sit in the audience and take copious notes. After we answer the question of why these guys violated their own rules of the road and didn't report the confirmatory studies. Now, I mentioned it's the 10-year anniversary of BEM's original paper. Now it's about 11 years. And this is important because the way that results are evaluated, typically, within the social sciences community, is that they're subjected to meta-analysis. The data is pooled together and determined to be confirmatory or non-confirmatory based on a pool of studies. Meta-analysis, by the way, is a term that was only devised in 1976. The first meta-analysis in history was performed by the pioneering parapsychologist J.B. Rhine, who, with his wife and intellectual partner Louisa Rhine, opened the parapsychology lab at Duke University in the early 1930s. And J.B. published a monograph along with some of his colleagues called ESP After 60 Years in 1940, in which he performed the first meta-analysis. I'm almost bashful about saying that because JB is actually given appropriate credit on Wikipedia, and as soon as the skeptics hear me talking about it, somebody will figure out a way to change that. But quick, screenshot it on Wiki while we're here. Go on your phones. Don't worry about being rude. And so BEM's material over a course of 10 years, thanks to his transparency, was subjected to meta-analysis. Now, I mentioned that one of the primary criticisms directed against parapsychological research is that it's not replicated. Now, that's not a fair criticism, and I'm going to leave it aside historically, and I'm just going to talk about this one case. BEM's numbers coming out of his precognition studies were proved confirmatory in a meta-analysis that consisted of 90 tests run in 33 different labs in 14 different nations, and they were found confirmatory. 90 tests in 33 different labs in 14 different nations. This does not mean that a majority of the 90 experiments proved confirmatory. They did not. In the schema of meta-analyses, and I'm putting this colloquially, there is thought to be about a 5% chance that your results are just happenstance. What you're looking to do is demonstrate that your pooled results have a spike factor, so to speak, above 5%. BEMS were at well over 20%, according to this meta-analysis that pooled 90 studies. So much for the non-replicability argument. Now, one of my concerns in terms of our efforts to probe the extraphysical, to probe the unseen, to probe the paranormal, is actually that we as a human community right now, we lack a good skeptical apparatus. And I'm usually very critical of my own house. For those of you who have read my material, you know I'm very dedicated to and interested in the question of mind causation, mind metaphysics, or what has been popularly known as New Thought. I level a great deal of criticism against my co-seekers within the New Thought community, even as I profess a deep interest in that material. Now, I think actually the community of people within ESP research, the community of people probing the UFO thesis, by and large, are doing really wonderful work. What we lack, actually, is a legitimate skeptical community that can help us do better. In 1790, the poet William Blake wrote in his great work, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, opposition is true friendship. Opposition, rightly directed, fortifies us. Almost a century later, Friedrich Nietzsche made a similar point when he wrote, out of life's school of war, what does not destroy me makes me stronger. Blake was perhaps possessed of a more generous nature than Nietzsche was, but they were both really saying the same thing. Opposition is true friendship. And I'm concerned about the paucity of intellectual excellence or even legitimacy within the skeptics community today. We need skeptics. We need skeptics. I want skeptics to look at the BEM experiments, for example, and say, where is there a problem? Was there a flaw in the methodology? Was there a flaw in the meta-analysis? Not violating their own rules of the road and then changing the subject, which is nonsense. I mean, that's what we have in politics. You know, do we need more of that? Do we as a culture need more of that? And it's funny in a way. I've debated with many skeptics, and I'm not possessed of naivete of human nature, and I'm not at a loss for the usual psychological explanation of why people shun material that upends their worldview. But even they have finally challenged my understanding of human nature. And again, all of us in this room are possessed of the basic psychological language that might explain why somebody wants to smash Galileo's telescope. We all get it. We don't like our paradigm upended. I don't like my paradigm upended. As I was saying to James Iandoli on his podcast, I don't want to wake up Thursday morning and find out that I've dedicated my life to an illusion. I understand how painful and how emotionally difficult that is for a person. I also understand that people who are possessed of a materialist outlook, and when I say materialist, I mean basically the philosophical belief that matter creates itself, they're hanging on to a point of view that while it's triumphant, is probably in its last generation of dominance. And I get it. I'm not unsympathetic to that position. But even still, it's difficult for me to understand the utter shallowness and incapacity to engage data emergent from within that community. I could come up with all the armchair psychoanalysis on earth, but I hit a wall. I hit a wall and I hit my limits. And I'm concerned about it because we in the seeking community have made considerable strides. Um, there are great barriers. The materialist point of view is dominant in most media, in most of academia, and I'm not unrecognizing of that. You know, your standard Victorian Christianity was not going to suddenly go away when Darwin's theories gained acceptance. So the cultural dominance is a very, very real issue. But I think they are faced with a situation where they're kind of running out of excuses for their paradigm. And it's drawing to a close, which doesn't mean that it's not going to linger for another generation or so, another 30 years or so. And I wish there were a voice emergent from within the skeptics community that was really prepared to engage these questions for real. I have to believe that that would make us better, that that would help us refine our search. And I find that the greatest hits of skepticism have grown really, really old. Uh, the hits, some of which I've touched upon, they usually involve uh, retreading experiments and either suppressing or cooking data if things don't go in the desired direction. Um, they involve using uh, Twitter-esque phrases like confirmation bias, which is really just a social sciences term for prejudice. We all experience it. The person who uses the term confirmation bias never seems to apply it back at him or herself, which is a sort of, I guess, a confirmatory that there's a good point there. Um, and, um, and then, you know, they'll use things like the law of large numbers, which dictates that because we live in what's presumed to be a large planet, um, strange things have to happen to somebody. But even if one were to abide by the standard rules of the road, apropos of the law of large numbers, look, you know, actuarial tables are pretty good at measuring the age at which, you know, men who live in Idaho are likely to have their wisdom teeth out, or you know, something like that. But they do not do a good job at capturing the emotional tenor of an event within the individual life. And this is extremely important because, with reference to some of the other material that's been talked about today, the experiences that the individual has with the UFO phenomena in particular are deeply, deeply intimate and personal. The Archives of the Impossible has assembled a wonderful collection of letters that were sent, as was referenced earlier, to Whitley and Ann Strieber. And you need only just pull some of these random letters to see the depth of testimony that is experienced by people who have um, who undergo firsthand encounter phenomena. And that brings me to another point, which is that we have reached an age at this point in the 21st century that William James was advocating for in the late 19th century, which is testimony is evidence. We have to, as a human community, incorporate that into our commonly understood scientific model. Testimony over time forms a record. It's evidentiary. Skeptics like to say, oh, it's just mere anecdote. You know, what's the difference between anecdote and testimony? Well, whether you agree with it or not, you know. I mean, it's a malady of human nature. But the fact is, we use testimony all the time. We don't really have a firm understanding, for example, of the um, workings of SSRIs or SNRIs, popularly prescribed psychopharmacological drugs. The individual goes to his or her therapist and says, well, is this working? Is that working? We'll tweak it. We'll see. It's based on a record of testimony. If you have the misfortune of going to a hospital and being in pain, you'll be asked to rate your pain based on a chart of emoji smiley faces to frowny faces. I mean, there's a testimonial aspect to all of our decision making in life that's worthy of the name. So we've reached a point where testimony is evidence. And I started out this presentation by saying that I think this conference has provided a really, really good model and a very healthy model of study into what might be called the anomalous, the extraphysical, the paranormal. These are all inadequate terms, but we have to use generalizations sometimes to communicate with one another. And that is that I think that we as a seeking community have hit upon a pretty good inside-outside approach in terms of dealing with inquiry within the current structures of our society. We have a media structure, we have an academic structure, and then we have a structure that's being created right here, right now. Many of the people in attendance here, many of the speakers who are part of this event have participated in, have woven in and out of both mainstream and independent institutions. Some of the folks who've spoken, including Sean and others, and Darren, have created academic structures, scholarly structures, I'll say, that go outside of traditional academia. Others, like Tim, have partnered with the wonderful work that Jeff Kripal and his colleagues are doing at Rice University, which has become the absolute epicenter at this moment for study into the extraphysical, in the same way that in the late 1960s, the Esalen Institute was an epicenter for Gestalt therapy or other forms of transpersonal therapy. And so I think we've hit upon a wonderful model where we will weave into and weave out of the mainstream institutions without being married, without being absolutely wed to those structures. The mainstream institutions do have a role to play. They absolutely have a role to play. And some very, very important things have come and will continue to come out of mainstream institutions that challenge paradigmatic beliefs. But at the same time, we also have to recognize the limits of those places and create our own structures. And I think that's precisely what this conference and its participants are accomplishing. So this Halloween, when the calls come in from journalist XYZ and they ask, is there an occult revival going on? I can answer, not everyone likes to use the term occult, and I really sympathize with that. So again, you'll forgive me. I don't want to get overly hung up on vernacular, but I can answer in the affirmative because the seeking community has worked so hard over so many decades and opened so many doors that these doors can never again be shut. And again, one event tends, just based on human nature and the history of human events, to bring other likewise events in its train. And things are opening up right now in a way that I think is profoundly exciting. And Darren made reference to the quote by Arthur Schopenhauer. First they ridicule it, then they radically attack it, and then they say it's self-evident. Well, if you want to call it progress, and I do, I think we're at number 2, where they radically attack it. And next comes it's self-evident. I hope some of you in this room are around, to see that day. And I want to put out a call not to our community, but to our opponents, because I presume this talk is going to go up on YouTube, and I hope it's around for a little while. I want to put out a call uh, to those who think that we've got it all wrong. And the call that I want to make is, again, opposition is true friendship. Uh, we are not interested in a go it alone approach. What we are interested in is being challenged in ways that are constructive, in ways that are informed, in ways that are real. Let's dispense with the sarcasm, the rhetorical questions, the verbal tricks, the sleight of hand, and let's get really down to the nitty gritty. If there are people listening to or interested in this event who consider themselves skeptics, I say, bravo, hold us to a higher standard and start by holding yourself to a higher standard. We need to move forward. We can move forward. We're going to move forward. And we will get there in a more constructive way by being refined by people who are really capable of doing so in a manner that is responsible, informed, and authentically skeptical. So my message is join us. And thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.